Thanks for coming out tonight. This is an event, part of the Central Wisconsin Book Festival, so I'm going to recognize some of our sponsors. The support for the 2023 Central Wisconsin Book Festival was provided through the Marathon County Public Library, the Portage County Public Library, and McMillan Memorial Library. The Community Arts Grant Program of the Community Foundation of North Central Wisconsin, with funds provided by the Wisconsin Arts Board, the Community Foundation, and the B.A. and Esther Greenheck Foundation. Support also provided by the Merco Foundation, Warzala, Reuter Ware Law Firm, the Marathon County Public Library Foundation, the Portage County Public Library Foundation, the Co-Vantage Cares Foundation, Center for the Visual Arts, Wisconsin Fellowship of Poets, Whitewater Music Hall, Stewart Inn, Wausau Elks, Lodge 248, Bound to Happen Books, Yankee Bookstore, and Timekeeper Distillery. And tonight, for our final event at McMillan, but there are more Central Wisconsin Book Festival events tomorrow. You can pick up a schedule out in the lobby. But tonight we have Peter Geye as the author of the award-winning novels Safe from the Sea, The Lighthouse Road, and Wintering. Winner of the Minnesota Book Award, Northernmost, and most recently the Ski Jumpers. Geye received his MFA from the University of New Orleans and his PhD from Western Michigan University, where he was editor of The Third Coast. He currently teaches the year-long novel writing project at the Loft Literary Center. Born and raised in Minneapolis, he continues to live there with his family. Please give a warm welcome to Peter Geye.
We will be very good friends by the end of the night. The group of us. Thank you for coming, and thanks, Colin, for inviting me and for bringing me back to this place in Wisconsin that I haven't been for about 40 years, and I'm eager to tell you more about the last time I was here. I'm here to talk about my most recent novel, The Ski Jumpers, a book that came out a year ago, almost exactly a year ago. And the book that I've written is the most personal, and I think the most fun. More about that too. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about my childhood. When I was 7 years old, one night, it was a Friday night, my dad, who I adored and looked up to and couldn't wait to impress, asked me if I wanted to be a ski jumper, if I wanted to try ski jumping. And I knew even at that age what it was because we had family friends who had kids that were just a little bit older than me that did it. And I knew enough to be a little bit nervous about it, but also enough to really want to try it. And as I said, I really wanted to impress my old man, so I said, let's do it. The next morning we went to a place in Minneapolis called Theodore Park, which was only about a mile from where we lived. And he introduced me to this sport. One of the misconceptions that people have about ski jumping, maybe not here because there's a ski jump not far from here, but in a lot of places, is that you put your skis on for the first time and you go off one of these huge Olympic-sized jumps. Well, that's not true, of course. You start on little tiny bumps, jumps that don't leave you more than a foot off the ground or in the air for more than 10 minutes. But even that was pretty daunting for the 7-year-old version of me. And I can remember the first day and all the tears that attended it, and my dad's frustration and my embarrassment and humiliation and all of those things that were, of course, exacerbated by me being a kid. And it might have been a good enough reason for me to stop right there. I'm really glad I didn't. I spent about the next 15 years of my life basically doing nothing but ski jumping. I spent a couple of years at Theodore Park learning on the jumps there, and then started traveling around. There were jumps then in Duluth and Cloquet and Ely, Minnesota. There still are jumps in Wisconsin Rapids in Madison, Wisconsin, and Westby, Wisconsin. And we used to go to all these places, my dad and I, and eventually my brother, who's 5 years younger than me, and the three of us. And we would go to these ski jumping competitions all winter long. We'd pack up the car on Friday night after work and go to some cheap hotel and spend our weekends together. Those weekends turned into week-long trips. My brother and I both became sort of nationally ranked jumpers, and we competed all over the country. We both tried out for the Olympics, and it remains even to this day. Both my brother and I have kids that are involved in the sport, that do the sport, that aspire to the same things that we aspired to. And so in many ways, this sport, guys looking like that, although a little bit better than that these days, has been foundational in my life. I mention all of this partly because I'm proud of it, but also because in a lot of ways, I've been writing this book since I was 7 years old. And that sounds crazy, I realize. But what I mean is that those first days together, that those first trips that we took together, my dad and I, and then my dad and my brother and I, were, as I said, my childhood. And they have become my adult life with my own son and my brother and my nephew and niece. And it's really hard as a novelist to, for me anyway, some novelists not at all, but for me to draw from my own personal life in a way that seems meaningful or might be meaningful to anyone. And it was certainly the greatest challenge that I faced writing this book. I worked on it for years. In fact, I actually spent about 14 years writing it. My first notebooks are from 2008, and they have a lot of anecdotes in them, scenes in them, that were cherry-picked from very particular memories that I had. Memories that were true to the best of my recollection, or true in the way that ski jumpers tell stories, which is a lot like how fishermen tell stories. But nevertheless, stories that were really meaningful to me and really a profound part of who I am and who I thought I was back then. And so it was really difficult for me to begin the process of changing those stories into the stories that would eventually become the characters in the book. And of all the lessons that I've learned as a fiction writer, and there's no end to them, there's a new one every minute it seems, that separation basically of what was true for me and what had to be true for the characters in the story was certainly the hardest lesson that I've had to learn. So why is that? I think part of it is that there's a sense of nostalgia that we have as people, especially if we've done something that's really important to us and impressionable for us as kids. Like I said, we remember it with this kind of halo around it. And for a fiction writer, at least the sort of writer that I am, that's treacherous territory. And treacherous because it can become predictable, or it can become mawkish, or it can become idealized or something. And certainly because it can interrupt what is actually necessary for the fictional story that I'm telling. It's also true that I didn't want to forget my own past and my own stories as I remembered them. They're the most, or some of the most anyway, cherished memories that I have. And so I really wanted to hold on to them. And giving them up meant a little bit less of that, and that was a hard thing to do. It was also true that it was extra difficult, I would say, to actually see who the characters in this book were going to be and who they might become, because, as I say, I was so careful about protecting my own stories. So I thought what I would do is read the opening few pages of the book and then tell you a little bit more about the story itself, and who these characters became that in many ways are, but in more ways are not, my dad and my brother and I. Doesn't require any introduction because it's page 1 of the book in a chapter called Dream, Memory, the Thing Itself. Even now, almost 4 decades since your last jump, you're ecstatic in flight. The memory is as indelible in your mind as it is in your old and softening body, which still, all these years later, will tremor you from sleep and dreams and go taut as though into the cold winter air above some steep, snow-covered landing hill. There in bed, under the soft down, you cock your ankles and lift your chin and rudder your hands as you close your eyes and pull back into the dream. And though, of course, there's no rush of air, no danger, the thrill remains. So does the peace. And it's into that peace you alight. Most mornings you'll coax a minute or two in the air. First, you find the hollowing sensation that comes with the leap itself. It was then, as it remains now, the surest sign of a good jump. You're lighter. You're empty of inhibitions. And it compels you forward, that hollowness, your hips following the emptiness and grace. A twitch of one shoulder, then the other as you accelerate, as the world simplifies. Just you in the air and the landing hill below. There's no concentrating now, only divination, only weightlessness and yearning, and for as fast as it always happened, timelessness. The stall, your pops called it, that moment when you reach the perfect position, when control and calmness met, and the speed vanished, and you were no longer flying, but only suspended there. Almost inanimate, like a bird on a gyre, a moment of reckoning. If the air was friendly, if you'd executed your jump properly, if you'd aligned yourself well, then you pulled and pressed and cajoled, not consciously, but by reflex and instinct. If you were lucky, the second act of flight was exultant. It was easiness, even as you accelerated, shredding the atmosphere and racing back to consciousness and the earth. It was your reward. Then your wings unfolded slowly, and slowly you breathed again. Your pops always said that landing was like shattering glass, but for all you learned from him, for all you believed in him, this was not your experience. Landing, for you, was an insult. And even now, in your warm bed, 40 miles and 40 years from any ski jump, it remains so. You open your eyes to the dark. You reach behind you to touch your wife's hand, Ingrid's hand, but she's not there, and you roll over, and not only is the sweetness of the memory gone, but so is she. The house is alive. She's beaten you awake. She's in the kitchen. You swing your legs out from under the covers. You put them on the ground. You've landed on another day. Dream, memory, the thing itself, what's the difference? You had your morning's dose of rapture, and now it's time to be him again. Me again. My eyes are gaining on the dark. I hear Ingrid running water to fill the coffee maker. I hear the cabinet door creak and the rattle of a spoon being lifted from the cutlery drawer. The clock on the bedside table tells me it's 5 minutes after 5 o'clock. I walk out into the hallway and follow the path of light to the kitchen sink and put my arms around Ingrid and settle into her backside, looking at us and the reflection of the window. She doesn't say anything. She appears about to cry. "You're up too early, sweetheart," I say. "I couldn't sleep." I nod and kiss her cheek and close my eyes and decide on another short detour from waking all the way. I hold her. We warm. How many nights have I hugged you like this, Ingrid? She doesn't answer, but I can feel her loosening. As quick as I can, I do the math. 10,000 it must be, more even. 15? And each one as sweet as the first, she says, the look of sadness blanching her face in the window again. I turn her around in my arms. We've plenty of these mornings left. Now she nods and kisses my cheek, then feigns one of her sweet smiles. These gestures we echo, they're the work of a 35-year marriage. Let me finish the coffee, I say. Nonsense, I haven't made the coffee and I can't even remember how long. Here. And she takes my elbow and urges me toward the kitchen table. She turns on the lamp hanging above the fruit bowl. She even pulls out the chair, as though I were feeble. What else do you want for breakfast? She's already back at the counter and spooning the grounds into the filter. Oatmeal? Toast? Just coffee, love. Oh, you've got to eat something, John. I will, but not yet. She presses the button to brew the coffee and returns to the table, but before she sits down, she raises a finger and hurries into the mudroom off the kitchen and is back before she's even left. She has a bag from the bookstore in her hand and she gives it to me and says, I stopped yesterday while you were resting. She nods at the bag. Inside are 3 of the notebooks I favor. Oh, Ingrid, you stop that. You heard what Dr. Zheng said yesterday. He said I should take up a foreign language. He suggested that merely as one option, she says. I resist the impulse to admit that I'm already sometimes unable to conjure words or phrases in my own language and instead take out one of the notebooks and peel the cellophane wrapper. You should be working, John. Now there will be more than one benefit. You'll be tolerable and you'll be taking care of yourself. She lifts my hand and kisses it, then holds it for a long moment. When she sets it down, she rises and goes to the counter and pours 2 cupfuls, adds a dram of cream to each, stirs them, and brings them back. Is it still okay to tease you? She asks, sitting back down. Oh, I'd never take that away from you. Thank goodness, she says. And you still want to go up to see Clara this weekend? Of course I do. She's looking forward to it. Our younger daughter, Clara, and her wife live in Gunflint now. They're artists, Clara a potter and Delia a painter, and they bought a small house just off the Burntwood Trail. In winter, the lake view through the bare aspen and birch surrounding them settles below in black and white layers, depending on the ice and snow. They both work multiple jobs, Clara at the brewing company, where she tends bar on weekends, and at the ski area in Misqua, where she's on the sales and marketing team. Delia works for the art colony and at the Burntwood Tavern. They're happy and young, and Clara describes their 5-year plan as one long working honeymoon in the most beautiful place they know. Clara has a surprise for you. Oh, is that right? Yep. She takes my hand and kisses it again. What time should we leave? I look at my watch, habit more than necessity. I can tell what time it is the way I imagine owls can. And anyway, it doesn't matter what time it is. I had a thought, I say, to call Noah and see if we can stop by the lake. Noah Tor is my best and oldest friend. Wouldn't that be nice, she says. I rearrange the notebooks 1, 2, 3 across the kitchen table. I've been waking up in those ski jumping dreams again. Noah tells me he has a trove of memorabilia I ought to see. Memorabilia, she scoffs. Ski jumping stuff, photographs, and whatnot. She gives me another sad smile. Another woman might be jealous. You go to bed thinking about it, you dream about it, you wake up thinking about it. It's in there deep, I admit, but you know that. Now I do more math. I reckon it's the only other thing I've done as often as kiss you good morning. Now she smiles more simply, or kiss me good night. She takes a long drink of her coffee and sets the cup down. If you and Noah are going to spend all morning talking about the good old days, I'll bring a book to read. She stands up and kisses the top of my head. I'm going to shower, and I'll make us something for breakfast when I'm done. She steps over to the junk drawer and fishes a pen out of the mess and sets it down in front of me. She tilts my chin up to meet my face. I'll take another kiss, please. So I do, and then watch her walk down the hallway. Ingrid, with all her sweet knowing and patience, is the one who's really going to suffer. My first thoughts, sitting in Dr. Zheng's office yesterday, went to sparing her. Don't get me wrong, she's up for the challenge, I'm certain of that. Our devotion to each other, I've always believed, is as sure as the morning coffee. It's one of the reasons we've been so happy together. And frankly, it's the reason we have this diagnosis now. At Christmas time, she noticed I was ill-tempered and forgetful of our traditions. "We've never made krumkaka," I said, or "we've never hung mistletoe." These things I know we have done required reminding from her. And we bickered about it, like she was unreasonable for wanting Christmas the way it has been done for the past 3.5 decades. There were other signs, too. She'd send me, to the grocery store for pancetta and eggs, and I'd come home with a box of cereal and a bunch of bananas. I'd walk around the house wondering where my satchel was while it was slung over my shoulder. These are just a few of the examples, and in truth, for the better part of 20 years, I've been forgetful and absent-minded. I tease myself about being old before my time, jokes she never found amusing. It was when I stopped them, though, that she finally said we should go see someone. So we did, and after 2 months of tests and examinations, Dr. Zheng told us what we had already come to expect: younger onset Alzheimer's. The litany of information and instruction that followed was overwhelming. The road ahead would be hard to predict. It was a disease that took many different routes. Likely I could still work for a year or two. We should make a financial plan, talk to my employer, tell my friends and family, do everything we can to keep my mind active. Dr. Zheng advised patience. To me, a whole gamut of stimulating activities. And if, after suggesting writing as one of those activities, and meeting Ingrid's rebuke that I was a writer, and a fine and notable one at that, the good doctor was embarrassed or surprised, she didn't let on. Instead, she walked us through the next steps and answered Ingrid's many questions. Me? Well, I guess my thoughts took a pretty frantic tour of my life and loved ones. I thought of my kids, naturally, Annika and Clara and Ben. They're all grown and making their own way. Annika lives in Minneapolis with her husband, Ben out in Boston where he goes to grad school, Clara, as I've mentioned, up in Gunflint. They're all three smart and healthy and well-loved, and though I'm very close with each of them, and though they'll no doubt be worried for me and sad for themselves and Ingrid, they'll also be fine. I thought of work, too. I teach English at the Liberal Arts College here on the hillside, and had been planning to retire soon anyway. Teaching has been a satisfying part of my life, but after 30 years, I've stopped being useful to my students. I don't know them anymore, and they certainly don't know the likes of me. Which is not a complaint. Over the years, we've had a lot to teach each other, and as careers go, it was a good one. But there's also the question of my other work, these books I write, or anyway have written, not least the one Ingrid thinks I should get working on with these new notebooks. So that's John and Ingrid waking up on this fateful morning. And their story, which is the story of a single day and the story of their long life and marriage together, takes place on that drive up to visit their daughter in a fictional town called Gunflint, which is sort of loosely based on Grand Marais, Minnesota, for those of you who might have been up there. It's a story of a happy marriage. They love each other very much. They love their children very much. Their children are doing well, as he observes. But they're making this drive with this brand new information about his future and his health, which is, of course, not great. The rest of the novel comes in the form of the story that he tells her on the way up there. And that story has two parts, really. The first is of a night 5 years before, 5 years to the day, in fact, of John's father's funeral. And that story recounts a night of reconciliation with his brother and his mother, reunion of sorts, certainly, but mostly a recounting of the past and of the events that led to the splintering of their family many years before. And it's in that childhood that my own life comes to bear on these characters. As I mentioned, much of that story is told through their adventures and the time that they spend as ski jumpers together, father and two sons. And so that gets us up to the question of why I finally got over the hurdle and why I thought it was important to write this story all together. And part of it is just sheer pig-headedness. I couldn't imagine having spent 10 years on a novel that I was never going to finish. And I actually play with this part of the story through John's character, who he too has been working on a book called The Ski Jumpers for a long time and never been able to finish it. So it was sort of like a contest between the two of us, who could finish it first. Of course, we would finish it at the same time no matter what. But also, it became a challenge for me and a sort of test of my own will to get over the things that were blocking me, which is to say, to trust my memories and my instincts as a storyteller, to find some common ground and to work together to tell this story. And I've always had the sensation after writing a book or while writing a book of growing into a kind of love with my characters. I think we heard Jeff talking about this a little bit earlier. You grow very fond of the people and you come to rely on them for all sorts of things, for moral judgment, for adventure that you can't have in your own life or that you might not want in your own life, for wisdom, for happiness, sometimes if your own life isn't especially great at the moment, any of these sort of things, in much the same way that we rely on our friends and family in real life. And I wanted to spend that time with the old version of me and with the old version of my father and my brother. When I was driving over here today, I was thinking a lot about it because we used to come here as a kid to Wisconsin Rapids to ski at the Tri-North Ski Club. One of my best ski jumping friends was a kid named Sean Arneson, who was a member of the Tri-North Ski Club, and his dad, Ole, was one of the old giants of the sport in the Midwest, and he was always around, and I just was spending all this time thinking about them and thinking about how 40 years have gone by since the last time I was here, or something close to 40 years anyway. And it seemed impossible to me. It seemed impossible that all that time would have passed and that somehow in those 40 years, and even in the 10 years before them or the 5 years before them, however many years it was that I spent coming here, that was the same life that I'm living now. And, you can start thinking about things like that and end up pretty far down the rabbit hole in no time at all. But I actually found just this enormous sense of comfort in the fact that was true, that I had that I had lived that life, that I had invented these characters, that the people back then, Ole and Sean, were as real to me as the characters that I created and vice versa. And that I got to have the pleasure of all that time, not just the pleasure of the ski jumping and the camaraderie, but the things that I learned along the way and that I got to imbue these characters with. And this book is in many ways, I might have said at the outset, a love story as much to my father and brother, both of whom the book is dedicated to, as it is to the sport of ski jumping, which was such an important part of our life. And I remember giving the manuscript to my dad and him reading it and just being bowled over in the way that he always was, and so proud and so happy. But the dedication page was conspicuously left off the manuscript that I gave to him. And when he saw the book for the first time, he cried like a baby, as I'd hoped he would. And I'm so grateful that I got the opportunity to share that with him and to to remind him, I guess, of what a huge part he played in all of that. I think he sometimes forgot later in life. And this is an especially meaningful talk that I'm giving, because it's the first time that I've talked about the book since he passed away just a month and a half ago. I was thinking a lot about that on the way down here today too, and how sad it is. And he remained a great friend of mine, one of my best friends all through life. But that we had those times, and for some reason, today was one of the first days that I wasn't overcome with grief at the thought of him having died. And I think it was because of where I was coming. And I don't know, the sustenance or the buoyancy of this place, and the times that we had here, and the memories that are so much a part of my life. So that's the story of the ski jumpers, and the story of my time as a kid, growing up doing that sport. I would normally turn it over to the audience. I think there's only 5 of you. I can count up to 5. But I would be happy to answer any questions that anyone has, or anything at all. If not, we can, yeah.
How did the first few books that you've written prepare you for this one? I mean, it seems like maybe this would be a tough one. In some ways, I could see this being a person's first novel because it is drawn from such personal things. But how did this being the 4th?
5th, yeah.
How did the first few prepare you to write this?
Well, I think that the observation that it might have made sense for this to have been the first book is true. I thought about writing this book for many years as I was becoming a writer and as I was practicing becoming a writer. And whether it was just good instincts or luck or who knows what that kept me away from it for as long as it did, I don't know who to thank or exactly how to acknowledge that. But I'm really glad that I did. This novel is narratively anyway a lot more complex than other novels that I've written. It has 3 timelines that are all braided together, and the sort of craft that was required of that I never could have done well 20 years ago when I was writing my first novel. And so somehow along the way, I learned enough as a writer to pick up those skills, or to pick up that intuition is maybe a better way of saying it. But I'd be really hard pressed to describe what the lessons were. I teach this course in novel writing. I've been teaching it for almost 10 years now. And one of the things that I try to impress upon people is that, for all that you might learn during the year of this course, and hopefully it's an awful lot, it's not necessarily going to prepare you for the next novel that you write. Because in my experience, at least, and in most of the writers that I know, in the experience of most of the writers that I know, that process is rarely the same thing twice. Yes, our habits might be the same, the type of pen that we use, or where we do our work, those things might stay the same, but novels are organisms unto themselves, and they require different kinds of sustenance and all of that. So I always feel surprised, or even maybe baffled sometimes, by the things that are required of me to write any given book. For this book, aside from getting over the nostalgia of it, and aside from overcoming the growing sense that I was never going to be able to pull this book off, it was challenging to tell that 3-parted story and to braid it all together. And I mean, I guess if I stop and think about it for a minute, like learning how to transition from one of those storylines into the next, that's one of the big things that is required of a novel told from from essentially 3 points of view. Pacing. This novel is longer than any novel that I've written previously, and so figuring out where it was too long, never a problem that I had before. I was always looking to add pages to previous novels, so I was taking pages away from this one. And really more than anything, and this will sound strange, maybe not, but to tell the story of a happy marriage and of people who were each other's lives, the way that John and Ingrid are each other's lives, and that family. I've never written that story before. People have always been unhappy, and the stories have been tragic, and this story is tragic as well, but it's tragic with a sense of, I don't know, of great happiness, or what to me was great happiness. So that's a very long answer. I just realized as I'm at the end of answering it. But it's one of those things that's so hard to pinpoint and say this and this and this, these are the things that worked. It's maybe it's a little bit like answering a question like, oh, well, what was your favorite part about, being married to your wife for the last 10 years? Or what did you learn in the first 10 years of your marriage that is going to help you in the next 10 years of your marriage? These questions that, surely there's something, and maybe if I really thought about it, I could answer, but off the top of my head, I don't necessarily know. My students hear answers like that all the time, and they're always just scratching their head at the end of it. Yeah. Does anyone ever go out to the ski jumps at Tri-North and watch them? Yeah. 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 Thank you. It's pretty. Not surprisingly. First of all, it's a very small sport. Even in its heyday, it was a pretty popular sport. So let's say 75 years ago, it was a very popular sport, especially in the Midwest. There were jumps all over the place. I think at one point, and I'm a bit of a historian, American ski jumping historian. At one point, there were like 70 clubs in America. Now there's like 30 clubs in America. And most of those clubs in America have, at the Minneapolis Ski Club, the ski club that's in the biggest city except for Chicago, which also has a ski club, we've got like 30 or 40 kids at peak times. So not, it's not baseball or basketball or football or soccer. And what it is, though, is, I have my first Minneapolis Ski Club card from 1977. And I've been a member of the Minneapolis Ski Club all that time. My dad, when he was in high school, was a jumper because it was a high school sport then. He lived only a few blocks from the ski jump at Theaterworth Park, then Glenwood Park. And so it's just what all him and his buddies did. Before him, his uncle was a ski jumper. Not a ski jumper like my brother and I were, or like my son hopes to one day be, which is to say a competitive, go around the country and maybe even go international to compete against other people. But, we just handed it down from one generation to the next. And so much so that, the people who, for example, at the Minneapolis Ski Club, the people who sort of keep the club alive are all people like my brother and I, or even people older than us, people who've been in the ski club for 70 years instead of 45 years. And that's just how it goes. It seems inevitable, honestly, that the sport won't make it that much longer. There's no money for it. People who love it like we do are dedicated to it, but none of us are wealthy. I guess probably some people are. I don't know who they are, but there's no funding for it. The club numbers are very small, and at a place like Iola that has a pretty good club, or Madison, which has a pretty good club, as long as there's new generations of families and of skiers to be involved, you know, maybe it'll keep going. But for example, in Eau Claire, where I guess it's the second biggest jump in Wisconsin after the big jump in Westby, that jump is condemned. I mean, it's iconic in American ski jumping, even in international ski jumping. But to replace it, to rebuild it, would cost $10 million. And, you know, for what? For a competition once a year that's going to have 50 skiers and a ski club that is also healthy by American standards, but that only has 30 or 40 jumpers on its best day. It's hard to justify that. So hopefully, you know, we can keep it going, whatever puttering, sputtering speed we've got it at. But I don't know. It seems it's harder and harder all the time. Yeah. Yeah.
Did that factor into the decision to write about it at all?
It definitely did. Yeah. I mean, an inclination to want to draw attention to it. And listen, the only thing more preposterous than trying to maintain a life in ski jumping is trying to be a literary novelist. And so, you know, I don't know how many people outside of the ski jumping community read this book and thought, oh, what a great representation of a sport that I sure hope that, you know, maybe I'll donate some money or maybe I'll get my own kid involved. I don't know. But I really did want to, especially as much for my dad and my brother as for the sport itself, but also for the sport itself to I mean, it's a big word, but to honor it and to memorialize it, at least my experience. And though our lives, our families' lives are nothing like the family story that gets told here, a lot of the ski jumping stuff is. And so that was a way of doing that. And that was definitely a part of my ambition. Yeah. Yeah.
Is it more popular in Europe?
Yeah.
And how's the book been received? Has it been printed in other languages? Have you ever been sent over there to talk about it?
So this book has not been translated, sadly. A few of my books have into a few different languages, but not this book. And so, no, it's not. You know, it's not gaining a stronghold in the nations where ski jumping is popular. And there are nations in Europe. I mean, it's a full-blooded sport there. Americans know it as, oh, that's that crazy sport you see on the Olympics once every 4 years for 5 minutes between figure skating. But in Europe, you know, there are venues where 100,000 people come to watch the tournaments, and there are multiple of those venues. And the nations that have that sort of following, there are great jumpers in the Scandinavian countries, of course, especially Norway and Finland. Great jumpers in Eastern Europe, Slovenia, in Central Europe and Austria, and tons of jumpers in Germany and Poland. Japan has a rich tradition in the sport. So it is, yes, it is, you know, I mean, it is, I hesitate to use the word, but the word that comes to mind, a real sport, like a real commercial sport in other parts of the world. And I actually think that one of the reasons that it's having so much trouble holding on here is that there aren't that many facilities in the United States that can comfortably, or even sort of in the you know, parameters of international rules, host an international competition. So I mean, it was only what 2002 that the Olympics were in parks in Salt Lake City, the Winter Olympics, and they built brand new jumps there. And for a long time, that's been the sort of epicenter of American ski jumping. But those jumps, even those jumps, are outdated and not up to the standards of the International Ski Federation and where they will allow like international World Cup competitions. So we don't have the facilities even in the United States. There's a great jumping complex in Lake Placid, New York, where the Olympics were in 1980 and sometime in the 30s, I think. And those jumps have just been redone. But they're in the middle of the Adirondack Mountains, hundreds of miles from civilization. And so, there's just we're very happy that they're redone and up to those standards. And they did just have a World Cup competition there last year. And international skiers were pretty excited to come to America to ski because they're excited to come to America and they like the jumps. But, there were 5,000 people in the audience instead of 100,000 people, or even, 30 or 40,000 people, which might be the average in the European venues. So it's complicated and it goes around and around in circles, but yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. I mean, we talk about this all the time. When I was a kid, we used to, shovel snow off the lakes into gunny sacks and buy the truckload and use that snow to fill in the jumps. And there are times, last winter included, where there's enough snow for us to rely on that snow. But I mean, even this is an example. We had to buy a new snow gun last year. The Minneapolis Ski Club did. That's $20,000. Our annual budget is about $20,000, for just the club operations. So now all of our money is gone, and we have to raise another $10,000 to pay the city for the water that we're going to use to make the snow. So now we're already $10,000 in debt. And, all the kids need new equipment. We need to keep the lights on at the jumps. We need to, pay for the diesel fuel for the groomer that we use to groom, all of these things. And at a certain point, and that's all money that we donate ourselves and, as a club we come up with. But it doesn't take anything at all for it to become totally impractical. Yeah. So, yeah.
Are there some ways that teaching the novel writing has helped you as a writer? Helped you think about writing differently?
Yeah.
Or
Yes.
others?
Yes, for sure. It is, how would I describe it? I often feel inspired at the end of a class. I mean, certainly I rely on, answers that I give all the time or topics that I address all the time, but I never go off a script. I don't have an outline. It's always just a conversation among writers. So I'm always surprised by what I discover I knew that I hadn't articulated to myself, or what someone tells me about their process that makes sense to me and that I adopt as a consequence of that. But more than anything, it's just this constant reminder of how important sitting down and doing the work is. I mean, there are all sorts of lessons that you can learn as a writer. The most important one is put your bottom in the chair sometime in the morning and don't get up until you're done doing the day's work. And, that's not possible for all writers, and it's not always possible for me. In fact, it's less and less possible for me. But certainly that part of the lesson, which is do the work, is reinforced all the time. But that inspiration that comes from the conversations just more generally, I think is where I, absorb or derive sustenance from those conversations. And I see people kind of, just really excited, even kind of giddy about the process. And I'm reminded of how it was to be like that. I'm positively devoted to my craft, and I love my time at the desk. But as a publishing author, there are other forces that come to bear on your day. And some of those forces sort of suck out that enthusiasm. And so being constantly reminded of that is one. And then also just being inspired by the work that they do. Before I taught this class and before I was a publishing writer, I was this devouring reader. And there's just much less time for that. And so it's through their stories that I get to devour most of what I read. And so I certainly draw inspiration and courage and excitement from that as well. Yeah. Yeah.
J. Ryan Strahl last night was talking about how he wants to keep writing about Midwestern characters, only to write interesting stories about Midwestern people.
Mm-hmm.
The crew, people on the coast, love, and that sort of thing. Do you see some of that? I mean, do you see maybe not a bias, but you know, the publishing world, the writing world, maybe not taking the Midwestern authors seriously? Do you ever think that?
You know, it's easy to say, oh yeah, for sure. And I think that probably the instinct to answer that way is true on some level. I think that, you know, I'll never forget, I was at a promotional, sorry, it took me a minute to find that word, promotional dinner in New York with a couple of writers, you know, like rising star literary writers who were from the East Coast. I think they were both from New York. So there were three of us, two writers from New York, a man and a woman and myself. And one of the, you know, as I was introduced, the, you know, the person who introduced me said he's here from Minneapolis. And after the introduction, I sat down and one of the other writers said, Minneapolis, is that in Wisconsin? And, you know, so there is like, you know, I mean, it's a big country, but, you know, and Wisconsin is right next to Minnesota, and they could in a lot of ways be the same place. But so there's, I think that there's, you know, almost a kind of, I don't even know, it just ignorance, you know. I don't think actually that if you look at the history of American letters, something I've done, I mean, I went to school way too long to learn about these things, that there is a bias against Midwestern or rural writers or Southern writers or Western writers. I mean, our literature, the literature of this country is just full of writers from all over the country. But I think that is true despite some of the powers that be in the publishing industry, which is like 90% centered in New York. And much of that power is relegated to young, untraveled people. And so I think that there is this sense like, oh, in order for a book to be a great book, it has to be set in New York or Los Angeles. And there's a lot of evidence of that. There's a lot of evidence of, you know, novels being published about those places, and they seem to get a lot more attention than books like J. Ryan's or mine that are set in flyover country. But I am not proprietary or precious about it. I don't apologize for being from the Midwest, from Minneapolis, Wisconsin. I don't think, certainly my favorite writers are all from places like here. I'm, you know, I have trouble thinking of a great novel set in New York that I loved. I mean, I kind of can't do it. And that conversation seems to me outside of my purview as a writer. Like, my job is to write the stories that I know to tell, that I'm qualified to tell, about people that I know intimately and that I can learn about in a way that might grow that intimacy. And I'm not worried about it if they read it in New York. I just am not. Once upon a time I was, and maybe I was more ambitious then, but I don't really care. Jay Ryan's younger than me. He's probably still, and he's more successful. You know, his books certainly sell better. So so maybe he's got a bigger chip on his shoulder.
I also wonder if it's with part of him living in California.
Yeah, yeah. That could definitely be true. I mean, I think there's a prejudice against even California writers in New York, you know, where that's like, oh, that's cute. Like you would write about the ocean or the beaches or something, you know. But, I mean, there are a lot of terrific, I can think of a lot of great California novelists, much easier than I can think about great New York writers. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I have a hard time getting riled up about it. And I don't think that Jay Ryan is riled up about it. I think he's just, you know, yeah, no, I realize that. I think he's certainly passionate about what he does and great at what he does. And I think we're super lucky to have him as an advocate for, you know, like I just saw he was, you know, on some literary blog or website or something, and the question was, you know, what are your 5 favorite books this year? And they were all Midwestern books, you know, so he's like one of those great advocates, which we're really, really lucky for. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. We did, in fact, become good friends.